Jorah Silven was a bright-eyed 10-year-old boy with a love for adventure. Melinda Varale was his devoted single mother, hiding a storm of secrets beneath her grief. Deputy Rex Mulder was the determined investigator unwilling to let the trail go cold, and Nico Grentz was the quiet sanitation worker who knew more than he ever admitted. When Jorah vanished from his backyard and his body later turned up in a Georgia landfill, the truth that unfolded was more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. Jorah Silven was the kind of child who seemed to shine a little brighter than the rest. At just 10 years old, he had a curious mind and adventurous spirit that led him to explore every corner of his quiet Calhoun, Georgia neighborhood. On the morning of his disappearance, the sun had risen high over the pine trees, casting long shadows across the backyards of the sleepy suburban street. It was a typical Sunday. Church bells rang in the distance, dogs barked at passing cars, and birds chirped from the wires above. That morning, Jorah had been playing alone in the backyard while his mother, Melinda Varale, took a call from her sister inside the house. It wasn't unusual for Jorah to entertain himself, especially on weekends. He had his bike, a soccer ball, and his beloved red backpack, which he often carried even when he wasn't going anywhere. The backyard was fenced in, and Melinda felt he was safe until she returned 10 minutes later and found the scene entirely changed. Jorah's bike lay on its side near the oak tree. His backpack was half unzipped on the grass, and the gate in the back corner of the yard was wide open. At first, Melinda thought he had wandered off, maybe chasing a squirrel or going to visit a neighbor. But as the minutes stretched to an hour, panic began to rise in her chest. She called his name. Number. Answer. She checked the street, the park, and every house on the block. Nobody had seen him. That's when she called the police. By that afternoon, a full-scale search had begun. Local officers, volunteers, and even a few off-duty firefighters joined in combing the woods and drainage ditches near the neighborhood. A helicopter scanned from above while bloodhounds tried to pick up Jorah's scent. Deputy Rex Mulder, a veteran with the county sheriff's office, was assigned to lead the investigation. He immediately noticed something odd about the backyard. There were tire tracks behind the gate, just past the edge of the fence. Fresh ones, curved into the grass. Melinda claimed she hadn't seen them before. Flyers with Jorah's face went up across town. News vans parked along the street. Melinda pleaded on television for her son's safe return, holding his favorite stuffed dinosaur in her trembling hands. She appeared devastated, her eyes hollow and her voice shaking. But as the days passed and no ransom demand came, no surveillance footage surfaced, and no physical evidence turned up, the case grew colder and darker. There were no witnesses, no signs of a struggle, and no known enemies. Investigators began to focus on the people closest to Jorah. That's where they always looked first. Melinda's personal life was scrutinized. She had raised Jorah alone since he was an infant. She had no current partner, but there had been one serious relationship in her past that stood out, a man named Tafan Dross. Tafan had lived with Melinda when Jorah was a toddler. He had a temper and a history of petty crimes, mostly involving drugs and theft. Their relationship ended with a restraining order after a violent argument turned physical. Melinda had never mentioned him during the early interviews with detectives. When questioned, she claimed she hadn't spoken to him in years and didn't think he would be involved. Still, Tafan became a person of interest. Investigators discovered he had recently relocated to a neighboring state, Alabama, and had not been working for several months. When asked about his whereabouts the day Jorah disappeared, he said he'd been alone at home. No one could confirm it. And then came a tip. One of Melinda's neighbors recalled seeing a dark green pickup truck parked near the end of their street late one night, 2 days before the boy went missing. It matched the description of a vehicle Tafan used to drive. Deputy Mulder kept the lead in mind, but didn't act on it right away. He'd seen red herrings before. The case was still open, with no body and no crime scene. But something about the emptiness of the backyard, the silence of the neighborhood, and the cold fear in Melinda's eyes told him that this wasn't a simple disappearance. This was something far more tragic. And the clock was already ticking as the search for Jorah stretched into its second week. The community's hope began to waver. Candlelight vigils turned quieter, news coverage thinned, and even the volunteers who once flooded the streets started to return to their routines. But Deputy Rex Mulder's investigation was only getting deeper. Beneath the surface of Melinda Varell's grief lay cracks that refused to stay hidden, and they all pointed to a past she hadn't fully revealed. Deputy Mulder returned to Melinda's home for another round of questioning. She looked worn, her hair unkempt and her eyes darker than before. She repeated her story word for word, the phone call, the backyard, the open gate. But this time, Mulder asked her directly about Taffin Dross. For a moment, she hesitated, her lips parting slightly as if searching for the right version of the truth. Then, she claimed she hadn't seen or spoken to Taffin in years. She called him a mistake and insisted he was not someone who would harm a child. Mulder wasn't convinced. He had already pulled records that told a more complicated story. The restraining order Melinda had filed 4 years ago painted a different man: possessive, volatile, and deeply manipulative. There had been reports of shouting matches, suspected drug use, and neighbors complaining about holes punched in the walls. When Melinda left him, she moved back in with her parents for several months before settling into her current home. It wasn't just the past violence that concerned Mulder, it was the timing. 2 weeks before Jorah vanished, Taffin had been seen in a pawn shop less than 30 miles from Calhoun. Surveillance footage captured him pawning a ring and asking for directions to a nearby bus stop. His sudden appearance so close to Melinda's home raised alarms. Mulder contacted the pawn shop owner and obtained a list of items Taffin sold. Among them was a set of old children's books, the kind often kept for sentimental value. A few had Jorah written in permanent marker inside. Tracking Taffin down wasn't easy. He had no official residence but was living in a rundown trailer just outside Birmingham, Alabama. When approached by local deputies and questioned about Jorah, Taffin remained calm. He said he had nothing to do with the disappearance, claimed he hadn't seen Jorah since the child was in diapers, and insisted the books were leftovers from the time he and Melinda lived together. He didn't ask about the boy's status. He didn't offer any condolences, but his story didn't fully hold up. Taffin said he'd been home all day on the Sunday Jorah went missing, but cell tower records showed his phone pinged off a Georgia tower that morning, roughly 10 miles from Melinda's neighborhood. When confronted with the data, he grew defensive, then refused to answer any further questions without a lawyer. He wasn't under arrest, and without physical evidence tying him to the crime, investigators couldn't detain him. The lack of solid leads left the case hanging by a thread. With Taffin no longer cooperative and Melinda's credibility under a shadow, Mulder turned back to the neighborhood. He re-interviewed residents, asking about anything unusual in the days before Jorah disappeared. That's when one elderly woman down the street mentioned something she hadn't thought important before: a green truck parked near the woods one night. She remembered it clearly because it was running without lights, and she thought the driver looked like he was waiting for someone. That detail matched the earlier report. And yet, there was still no proof that truck belonged to Taffin. With pressure mounting from media and higher-ups, Mulder ordered a full forensic sweep of the woods behind Melinda's home. The team found cigarette butts, candy wrappers, and a half-buried shoelace, but nothing they could definitively link to Jorah. The shoelace, thin and bright blue, was sent to the lab anyway. Weeks had passed, and still no sign of the boy. What began as a hopeful search was turning into something grim. And though suspicion lingered over Taffin like a dark cloud, the truth remained buried. Somewhere out there, the answer waited silent, buried under layers of secrets and lies. 3 weeks after Jorah Silven disappeared, the case that had already rattled the town of Calhoun took a chilling and irreversible turn. On a muggy Tuesday afternoon, under a blazing Georgia sun, a sanitation worker named Nico Grentz was doing his routine shift at the Dalton County landfill. It was just another day, another mountain of garbage to sort through. But as Nico monitored the conveyor belt, his eyes locked onto something that didn't belong: a large black duffel bag wrapped tightly in layers of plastic. It looked too clean, too new, and it had a shape that made his stomach tighten. Landfill workers were trained to report anything suspicious, and Nico followed protocol. The bag was flagged, removed from the line, and handed over to supervisors, who quickly called law enforcement. When officers arrived and carefully opened the layers, the smell was immediate. Inside was the decomposing body of a young child. A coroner confirmed later that night what many already feared: it was Jorah Silven. The landfill was shut down indefinitely, and the site was cordoned off. Investigators knew they had a narrow window to trace the bag's origin. Deputy Rex Mulder was called immediately. The discovery of the body transformed the case from a missing persons file into a homicide investigation. The mood in the sheriff's department shifted instantly. There was now a victim, a confirmed crime, and an urgent demand for answers. Deputy Mulder requested all GPS and collection records from the sanitation department. He focused on trash routes covering areas around Melinda Varell's home, hoping to match the timing of pickups with when the bag was most likely dumped. The landfill's intake records were meticulous. Based on the decomposition and contents of the bag, experts estimated it arrived within the past 4 to 5 days. That narrowed the possible locations drastically. As the data poured in, one detail stood out: on the exact day the duffel bag likely entered the waste system, a garbage truck servicing a small loop of homes just outside Melinda's neighborhood had made an unscheduled collection. That truck had deviated from its route briefly and passed through a service alley, where household trash had not been scheduled for pickup. The driver assigned to that truck was none other than Nico Grentz, the very man who had reported the discovery. At first, investigators considered the possibility that Nico had simply stumbled upon the bag by chance. But something felt off. When they interviewed him, he seemed nervous, more than what would be expected after finding a child's body. He repeated his story with careful wording, never straying from the official timeline. He said the bag had come down the belt. He saw something strange, and he reported it. But when pressed on the extra pickup, Nico hesitated. He claimed there was confusion about the route, that he had picked up some missed bins from the previous day. However, the sanitation log showed no missed bins on that street, and no complaints had been filed by residents. Investigators dug deeper. Nico had recently moved out of his home 5 miles from Melinda's house, just days after Jorah was reported missing. The timing, coupled with the unscheduled pickup, raised serious concerns. Deputy Mulder obtained a warrant to search Nico's former residence. The property was unassuming, a single-story home with a dying lawn and boarded windows. Inside, everything seemed stripped. But in the bathroom, forensic specialists found high levels of bleach residue. In the crawl space, hidden beneath insulation, were fragments of a child's t-shirt and a sock balled up and pressed into the dirt. In the garage, investigators discovered a roll of plastic identical to the kind used to wrap the duffel bag. Evidence wasn't enough for an arrest yet, but the picture was becoming clearer. What troubled Mulder most was a simple, unanswered question. Why would a man hide evidence, move away, and then be the one to report the body? It didn't make sense unless there was more to the story, something deeper, something worse. For now Nico Grentz wasn't confessing, but the secrets he carried were beginning to surface. One bag of trash at a time, with mounting evidence pointing toward Nico Grentz, Deputy Rex Mulder intensified his investigation. The sanitation worker's quiet demeanor and seemingly innocent tip-off no longer felt coincidental. The inconsistencies. In his story, the bleach-soaked bathroom, the plastic wrap in the garage, all signs pointed toward involvement. But the puzzle still had missing pieces. No fingerprints were on the duffel bag. No direct link tied Nico to Jorah before the boy's disappearance. The motive was murky, and the timeline was shaky. Deputy Mulder decided to re-examine every detail. From Nico's life. Background checks revealed Nico had no prior arrests, no record of violence, and no formal complaints at his job. He lived alone, kept to himself, and was regarded as quiet but reliable by his co-workers. But further digging uncovered something strange. Nico had worked sanitation in Calhoun for just over a year, but his previous job had been in another state, in a different waste management company, where he resigned abruptly. The reason: personal issues. No further details were available. Determined to uncover more, Mulder contacted the previous employer and learned that Nico had been questioned in a separate investigation 2 years earlier. A young girl had gone missing in a nearby town, and though the case went cold, Nico's truck had passed her neighborhood during his route. Nothing had come of it then, but the connection now felt chilling. Back in Calhoun, forensic experts continued analyzing items from Nico's former home. Under UV light, they discovered microscopic blood spatter in the bathroom sink and baseboards. DNA confirmed it belonged to Jorah Silven. The evidence was finally mounting into a case strong enough to confront Nico head-on. Deputy Mulder brought Nico in for a formal interrogation. Nico appeared nervous, sweaty, and pale. He clung to his original story, repeating that he had found the duffel bag during his shift and didn't know anything else. When presented with the evidence from his house, the blood, the clothing, the plastic wrap, Nico's demeanor changed. He stopped talking. He requested a lawyer. The session ended without confession. Still, there were unanswered questions. Why had Jorah's body ended up in the landfill if Nico was trying to hide the crime? Why report it himself? And why hadn't he fled after moving? The turning point came unexpectedly. Investigators seized Nico's phone and during a forensic scan found a deleted message thread from 3 weeks earlier. The messages had been erased but partially recovered. They were from an unsaved number, but the writing style was familiar, cold, sharp, and manipulative. The messages appeared to be instructions. One message stood out. Pick it up Tuesday. Cash in the mailbox. Keep your mouth shut. Tracing the number led to a burner phone registered under a false name, but its location data revealed it had often pinged near Melinda Varel's residence. The number had called her phone several times in the past month. Investigators circled back to Melinda. She had remained cooperative throughout the investigation, attending every vigil, sobbing during interviews, and clinging to Jorah's memory. But when questioned about the calls from the burner phone, her answers began to shift. She claimed she didn't recognize the number. Then, she claimed it might have belonged to a neighbor. But her hesitation spoke volumes. Deputy Mulder obtained another warrant to search Melinda's home, this time with a fresh perspective. In the attic, stuffed inside an old box of winter clothes, officers found a manila envelope filled with cash, totaling nearly $2,000. Alongside it was a receipt for a prepaid phone card dated 3 days after Jorah's disappearance. The scenario took a darker shape. It wasn't a random act of violence or a case of stranger danger. It was a cover-up, likely involving both Nico and Melinda. One had the body. The other had the motive. The quiet sanitation worker hadn't acted alone. And the grieving mother who had once appeared so broken might have been the orchestrator all along. The truth, once buried in garbage and lies, was now crawling into the light. But one final piece still had to fall into place. Deputy Rex Mulder knew the case was finally unraveling. The pieces were there: Nico Gruntz's disposal of the body, the hidden money and prepaid phone linked to Melinda Varel, and the haunting discovery of Jorah's remains. Still, there was No confession, no exact explanation of what happened the day Jorah vanished. The puzzle wasn't complete until someone finally broke. That moment came 5 days after Melinda's second home search. Pressed with mounting evidence, Melinda was brought in for another round of questioning. This time, she didn't arrive in tears. Her face was stiff, guarded, as if she knew there was no way out. Investigators laid out everything: photos from the landfill, blood evidence from Nico's home, the phone data, and the cash envelope in her attic. With nowhere left to run, Melinda finally cracked. Her story was not what anyone expected. Jorah hadn't been kidnapped. He hadn't been lured away or dragged from his yard. He had died inside the house, suddenly, violently, and by her own hands. According to Melinda, it started with an argument. Jorah had broken a vase that belonged to her late mother. It wasn't the first time they argued, but this time, something in her snapped. In a moment of rage, she shoved him harder than she realized. His head hit the edge of the coffee table. He didn't get up. Panicked, she tried to revive him. When she couldn't, fear overtook logic. She waited nearly an hour, sitting beside her son's lifeless body, until she made the worst decision of her life. She didn't call 911. Instead, she called someone she thought would help her cover it up: Nico Grentz. She had known Nico casually through trash pickups, having spoken to him a few times in passing. She remembered his quiet nature, how he once mentioned needing money. That was enough. She contacted him using a prepaid phone, offered cash, and pleaded with him to help her get rid of the body. The next morning, she wrapped Jorah in a blanket, placed him in a duffel bag, and left the bag inside her garage. Nico arrived before sunrise. He didn't ask questions. He simply took the bag and promised to dispose of it. But guilt gnawed at him. He moved out of his house days later, unable to stay in the same place. When the duffel appeared at the landfill, it was likely out of his own conscience or fear that it might eventually be found anyway, that he decided to report it himself. With Melinda's confession recorded and the physical evidence tying both her and Nico to the disposal of Jorah's body, charges were filed immediately. Melinda was arrested for involuntary manslaughter, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to dispose of a body. Nico was charged with tampering with evidence, unlawful disposal of a body, and obstruction. Both were denied bail. The small town of Calhoun was left shaken. What had begun as a mysterious disappearance had unraveled into a dark story of fear, poor judgment, and irreversible loss. Jorah Silven's funeral was held a week after the arrests, with the entire community in attendance. Flowers lined the pews, and his teachers shared memories of his kind heart and curious spirit. His grave was marked not just with his name, but with the weight of a tragedy that should never have happened. Deputy Mulder closed the file on the Silven case with a heavy heart. He had solved the mystery, but there was no satisfaction in the truth. The final chapter had been written in grief and guilt. A child's life was gone, not because of a monster lurking in the shadows, but because of a moment of rage and a desperate attempt to erase a mistake. Justice had been served, but the cost was too high. Asterisk.